tell me a little bit now. You go and you're back and you're working for Fred at WRIF. What was that like?
Oh my God.
To officially now work with your brother.
I turned out to be a top salesperson at the station, and it was great because I had a lot of the accounts that interacted with programming. So of course I go down to Fred and go, hey, I've got this great opportunity, and we'd work it out and it'd be great for the station. I'd make a lot of money. It was cool. So, but this also I felt gave me carte blanche to make suggestions to Fred about programming, even though I'm not qualified to be a program director, but I figured I was because he was my brother. So occasionally I'd walk down there and go, you're playing the wrong track off the Seeger record. Or why are you rotating Stairway to Heaven, 3 times a day? People are getting sick of it. And, he humored me for a while, but if you know Fred, he can cut to the bone. Finally, one day he turns to me and he goes, why don't you just shut up and make goal?
Benztown president Dave Chachi Dennis loves radio and all of his radio friends.
Hey, Chachi.
Hey, everybody.
Because Chachi loves everybody.
For the last 40 years, my next guest has provided programming, digital and revenue generation, consulting and research to commercial and public radio stations around the world. He's run radio stations in Dallas and Detroit. His company's blog has become a must-read, and he has been at the forefront of championing radio's future in the car, digitally, and in mobile devices. He is a frequent speaker at various conventions around the world, including the NAB, numerous state broadcaster association conventions, and at public radio conferences, including the Super Regional and PMDMC. He is the board chair of the Greater Public, as well as the past board chair of the Michigan Association of Broadcasters Foundation, a 2016 inductee into the Michigan Broadcasting Hall of Fame. In 2019, he received the Conclave's Rockwell Lifetime Achievement Award, and in 2021, he was awarded the Distinguished Alumni Award from Michigan State University's Com Art Sci Department. In 2022, he received the National Radio Award from the National Association of Broadcasters, which is the highest honor awarded in the radio industry. Please welcome Paul Jacobs, the Vice President, General Manager of Jacobs Media. Paul, welcome, man. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, it's great to be here, and I'm either really old or I never sleep after that introduction. My goodness.
That is an incredibly impressive resume. I'm really happy. And by the way, I want to mention, I was looking right before we jumped on, this is actually the 50th episode. So this is like kind of a special episode. And it's an honor to have you for number 50. I got to interview Fred, I guess about a year ago, which was incredible. And then I got to spend some more time with the two of you in Vegas at CES just a few weeks ago, which I really, really enjoyed. And before we jump in, because I have a bunch of questions you can imagine, but I just want to thank you on behalf of the industry for everything that you and Jacobs Media does for the industry. I think your blog and all the studies and everything that you put out is really just invaluable, and thank you for all of that.
I appreciate that. Several years ago, I think it was after the financial downturn in 2008, a lot of people started dooming and glooming the industry. And Fred and I looked at each other and thought, even in our blog, well, that could be easy, but it does nothing. And at that point, we kind of recommitted ourselves not to be industry cheerleaders, but to really try to provide some leadership and vision. And we could become constructively critical and really try to move things forward. And that's the path we took. And I have to tell you, it's added longevity to our lives and our careers. We're having more fun. And we kind of enjoy, like you saw a couple weeks ago at CES, taking people and going, hi, there's all this other stuff out there happening in the world. Isn't it cool? How about we participate in it?
Yeah, man, I love that. I love that overall ethos because I couldn't agree more. I think we're all in this industry because we love it and we're incredibly passionate about it, and we want to put out great entertainment and content for listeners ultimately. And it is tough. There's no denying that, but it's absolutely a healthier way to live, and I think a lot better way to move forward in an optimistic nature than it is in a negative nature. And there are a lot of naysayers that I think just ultimately it leads to just negativity that doesn't need to be there. So I appreciate that greatly. Thank you for your leadership.
No problem. I mean, I'd much rather be part of the solution than the problem.
Very well put. Tell me a little bit about growing up in Michigan.
Man, we were so lucky. We had great parents, very middle class, with a lot of ethos wafting in the house. I mean, my father was a World War II vet, and when he got out, it was kind of like It's a Wonderful Life. He got stuck in Detroit running his father's company, and the reason why he did was because he wanted to make sure his father had enough money to live on in his latter years. So he kind of gave up his career to do that for his father, and as a result, didn't make a whole lot of money. Then when his father passed, he sold the business and became an entrepreneur, which is where we get it, and partnered with somebody else. And in his later years, really did well. And, people ask Fred and I, we started out with ABC. Why did you form your own company? Well, it was kind of baked in. I mean, Fred and I had a bagel route in Detroit, selling and delivering bagels in New York Times. I was 9, he was 12. And even in the winter, we'd be riding on bikes on Sunday mornings delivering bagels. So
I love that. Sounds like even a great service today. I would love to have some bagels delivered.
Well, and then we expanded and added locks. So, I mean, come on. It was, it was a burgeoning business. But that was kind of the ethos of our family. And we were really blessed with terrific parents. And, but I will tell you, Fred and I did not get along at all.
Really?
Yeah, we were very different. I was kind of a jock, and he was, a war protesting, really smart dude. And we wound up getting together in college. I was at Michigan State. He had just graduated Michigan, and he came to Michigan State to get his master's, and he was teaching in the radio program, which was part of his master's thing. And I actually took his class. And it was
no way. That's wild.
Yeah, it was the entry level radio class, and he kicked my butt. I mean, it was hard, and I aced it, and believe it or not, that changed our relationship.
What a fantastic story! And was that your first interest in broadcasting and radio, or did you have some interest prior to that class?
I always knew the reason why I chose Michigan State was it had a really good advertising and media program, and Michigan didn't, which is where he went. So I was into it, but I didn't have a path until I took that class, and then wound up like him, living in the radio studios like college radio people. And, of course, then I heard my first tape, and it was like, on air is not for me. But I really was raised as a sales guy. I mean, again, I got that from my dad. And when I was 9 with the bagel company, I was the one who would make the sales calls to neighbors on Saturday, okay? Because Fred wouldn't do it. He was programming. So
was this bagel company your company? You guys started it, or you? Oh my God! I had thought that this was a service and you were hired.
No. It was my dad's idea, and yeah, it worked out great. And
I love that spirit.
So when it came time to graduate college, I knew I couldn't be a DJ, and I had no idea what I was going to do. And I wound up going into sales, and that became my path, and programming became Fred's, and, really worked out great. And by the way, being from Detroit, we take a lot of guff, except for this year with the Lions.
But, congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. But that's also who we are. There's a Midwest. We build things here, we do things here. And we kind of look at ourselves through that lens, with a lot of pride and sense of place. And hopefully we reflect that out to the industry.
One of my dear friends is from Detroit, and as the Lions were in the playoffs and having a great run, he posted on his Instagram page. It was a meme, but it was Detroit versus the world.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of denotes the spirit of the city. You guys feel like it's you against the world.
There is a little attitude. So yeah, I mean, I won't give you the Chamber of Commerce pitch, but this is a very unique, wonderful place to live. I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, I've been there a few times, and you're right. Sometimes Detroit gets a bad rap, like New Jersey, for instance. But I've really enjoyed it, and what a beautiful, done such a great job at the downtown and Ford Field and Co-America Park, and I mean it's really nice.
Yeah, it's special. It's incredibly diverse. It is incredibly into the arts and creativity, and yet we build cars. So I mean, it's got all of these different aspects to it, which is what makes it so unique. I mean, I travel 30, 40 weeks a year, and I've seen every city in the country. And so many of them are just cookie cutter Applebee's, Courtyard by Marriott's, Walmart's.
Sure.
When you're in a place like Detroit, you're there. And so, that's kind of part of who we are.
Was your first job at NIC in Detroit as an account executive?
Yeah. Here's another layer to that story. So I'm about to graduate and sat down with Fred. And I'm like, I have no idea what I'm going to do. So, Fred at like 23 is getting his master's. And part of that program that he was in was he had to provide counseling to other students. And one of the people he was providing counseling to was Ed Christian, who already owned radio stations and knew 10 times more about the radio business than Fred did, even though Fred was his counselor. And Ed had just moved to Detroit to become the general manager of WNIC. So Fred said, hey, I'll call Ed. Maybe he'll give you a sales job. And I'm like, what do I sell? I had no idea. And so 2 days after I graduated college, I'm out selling airtime for a 0.6 radio station. It was great.
That's incredible. That's a big gig. So now you're major market right out of school and in green in a lot of ways, and working for, at that point, I mean, Ed was already well established, and then obviously went on to, start Saga. I guess he had already started Saga at that point, and you got to look at what Ed accomplished. And probably one of the things that I regret is I never got to interview him before he passed. But the fact that he built a company that still stands today and is debt free is really impressive. And he was very methodical about where he bought the radio stations and the markets. I mean, very, very bright guy.
Yeah, he really was. And, the legacy of his company and the condition that it's in, is a real testimony to him. I will tell you, so I started selling this radio station. It had a 0.6 and it had just changed format, and it was FM, to a brand new format not heard on the radio called soft rock FM, kind of the forerunner of AC. And I think it was all 2 book markets at that point. So for 6 months, I sold literally without ratings. And about 3 weeks before the rating book came out, our sales manager and our top salesperson got fired because they were sleeping together. So I wound up with like this huge account list, of all the big agencies in Detroit, Chevrolet and McDonald's and stuff. And 3 weeks later, we got a 9 share in the book.
Oh, man, that's incredible. Your ratings went up by like 2,000%.
Yeah, I'm like, wow, this is easy. They're calling me. Yeah, so.
So now you're early 20s. You've got a radio station that's on fire, and you've got the biggest list at the station. And are you feeling at this point like I've got this figured out?
No. Well, I felt that way, but I'm gonna go back to my dad. So I'm making a ton of money. I mean, it was ridiculous how much money I was making, in 1977. But I was also, kind of lying around taking orders. And my dad calls me up and he takes me to lunch and he goes, "You're effing this up." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? I'm making all this money. I got a brand new car." He goes, No. You are developing horrible habits and it's going to cost you. It's too easy for you. That was the kind of guy my dad was. And I reflected on it and he was right. And a couple months later, I was doing a speaking gig at Michigan State. They brought students back. And they had a visiting professor, Bill Robinson, who owned a marketing services company in Chicago as a visiting professor. And he offered me a job. He goes, you come to work for me, I'll give you even more money. And so I quit on Ed. And if you know Ed, once you quit, you're dead. And yeah, it was not a good parting. But I went to Chicago to work in the ad business. And a year in, I realized I hate the ad business. And so at that point, Fred was programming WRIF, or as research director at WRIF, soon to become program director. And I moved back to work for my all-time favorite radio station in Detroit. But it was my father who once again really straightened me out. And I've never forgotten that.
Yeah, what a fantastic life lesson, and also speaks to the relationship that you had with your father. You guys were that close. I think a lot of people, especially at that age, you're making money, you're driving a brand new car, you're living large. It would be hard to give that up, reinvent yourself, move to Chicago. But I'm sure even though you didn't probably enjoy that experience or you look back at it, but I'm sure you learned just to be on the other side of it and what it was like to be in the ad business is a whole perspective that I think all of us could benefit from.
And getting out of radio made me appreciate radio that much more. So by the time I got to WRIF, which was about to explode in greatness, I was ready.
Really quick, when you were in Chicago and you're an account executive at the agency, so now you're calling on advertisers to get them to work with the agency, and you're pitching your creative services and your ability to grow their brand?
Yeah, I was handed, I managed 2 accounts. And again, I'm in my mid-20s, early 20s. Philip Morris and a camera company called Vivitar. And Philip Morris is on Park Avenue and 39th in Manhattan, and Vivitar is in Santa Monica, California. So I'm traveling back and forth across the country, dealing with high-level people that I frankly wasn't qualified to do. And I learned so much. I mean, that exposure for me into big cities, into, different kinds of thinking and different level people. I didn't enjoy the work, but man, it was like a master's degree at that point in my life.
Yeah, I bet that side of the business has always been very interesting to me. I could get into a whole other chapter and learn more. Tell me a little bit now. You go and you're back and you're working for Fred at WRIF. What was that like?
Oh my
to
God.
officially now work with your brother?
Well, it was crazy because Fred was such a brilliant, and I won't even say program director. I mean, he was a brand manager and a brand visionary before there was such a thing. And he took WRIF from being a radio station to becoming the voice of Detroit in every single way. And so in that regard, I was along for the ride. But I will tell you, we had our moments. So I turned out to be a top salesperson at the station, and it was great because I had a lot of the accounts that interacted with programming. So of course I go down to Fred and go, hey, I've got this great opportunity, and we'd work it out and it'd be great for the station. I'd make a lot of money. It was, it was cool. So, but this also I felt gave me carte blanche to make suggestions to Fred about programming, even though I'm not qualified to be a program director, but I figured I was because he was my brother. So occasionally I'd walk down there and go, you're playing the wrong track off the Seeger record. Or why are you rotating Stairway to Heaven, 3 times a day? People are getting sick of it. And, he humored me for a while, but if you know Fred, I mean, he can cut to the bone. Finally, one day he turns to me and he goes, why don't you just shut up and make goal? And that set the rest of our course. But we had a great time because it was really our first collaboration on something. And he was doing just great things with this radio station, with talent, with promotions, and, taking radio stations to, frankly, where most of them aren't anymore in terms of their impact and connection with their city. And I looked at every one of those opportunities and climbed on board. So by far the most rewarding, most fun 4 years of my career.
So in what's I think especially unique about it, especially in, at that time, even when I first got in the business, there was in a lot of ways a wall between programming and sales, and a lot of friction could really develop between those two departments. And it sounds like you guys were really ahead of your time, and that you were already doing a lot of brand integration into content, and because of your relationship, you were able to basically create these win-win situations for the listener and for the client.
Yes, except Fred was Fred and loved pushing the envelope. So, Fred was not above pissing off advertisers if if there was a win. And so, I mean, you may remember back then, WRIF had the iconic racetrack logo that ABC stations had. And, we had the call letters in the bumper sticker, but then baby became a big thing because of our afternoon host, Arthur Penhollow. And then a new slogan kind of emerged in the city, kick-ass. And so Fred, of course, produced 100,000 kick-ass bumper stickers. And there were a couple of advertisers who just didn't want to have their brand associated with a station that did that. And, a couple of our account executives brought some agency people in to meet with Fred to complain about it. It wasn't pretty. Because he basically said to them, shut up and make goal. You don't know anything about programming. So, look, it was ABC and, they were in it to make money. And Fred understood that if we could get those bumper stickers paid for or big concerts paid for. So we were doing all that in the 70s and early 80s that are now kind of standard today.
Right. Definitely ahead of your time. And just that the passion for that radio station is, what was incredible. It was one of those, a lightning in a bottle and just absolutely impressive where in my understanding was, it was one of those deals like just everywhere you went, you heard WRIF, when you walked into stores and you heard people driving by in their cars and the window was rolled down. It was WRIF on the air.
It was insane. And again, the WRIF bumper stickers, and I encourage your listeners to just Google WRIF bumper stickers because we produced a sticker for every band that came into town. And so
I didn't know that.
Oh my goodness. Yes. And then we did it for the Tigers and the Lions and the Pistons and on and on and on. And I mean, I couldn't guess at the percentage of vehicles that had some form of WRIF bumper sticker. But
I love that.
I bet 15 to 20% at any one time. I mean, it was insane.
What a phenomenal idea. Where did listeners get the bumper stickers? You would have a retailer that you tied into the promotion or?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, we would, again, Paul would sell the back of the bumper sticker to McDonald's and there'd be a coupon for a Big Mac. We didn't get all of them paid for, but we got a lot of them paid for. So again.
What a great idea. Yeah. I'll Google that. I'll Google those images. Yeah. So you're there and then you decide now to kind of reinvent yourself because you moved to go to Dallas.
Yeah. I was young and arrogant and I felt at like the age of 28, I deserved to be in management and ABC passed me over. There was an opening at WRIF and I didn't get it. And they were right, but I was young and arrogant. And a couple of ABC people, Marty Greenberg, who ran the FM owned and operated, and Jay Hoker, who was my general manager in Detroit, moved to Dallas. And Jay was hired to build up a radio company for a newspaper company, Belo Broadcasting. And Jay came down to be the GM of their rock station, KZoo, which was a pretty legendary station in Dallas. So Jay hired me to be his local sales manager. So at the age of 28, I became a LSM in a top 10 market, still trying to figure stuff out.
It's a big role and, a big responsibility. You were there for a few years. How did it go?
It turned out great. I moved up to GSM and the station did great. And we honestly brought, it was a very, very good radio station when we got there. And we brought a lot of WRIF thinking to it promotionally and sales wise, and it went great. The problem was 4 years in, Belo decided they didn't want to own a radio company and they sold it. And so there I am in Dallas going, now what? So that's where I was.
I'm wondering too, you'd been in the Midwest, Chicago and Detroit at this point. I know you traveled quite a bit, so you had a lot of experience from people around the country, but what was it like moving to Dallas, which is in a lot of ways a very different market than Chicago and Detroit?
It was weird. There were parts of it that I liked. We had no children at that point, my wife and I, so it was a great market to be single in, to be unencumbered. Culturally, it was not the Midwest. And I knew I was not going to spend my life there. It was a good summer camp experience. How's that? But when, but a couple years later, I became a GM for another radio station in Dallas. And then Jay called me and he had bought a station back in Detroit and said, come on up, go back home, go run your radio station. And so that's how I wound up back in Detroit.
Got it. Yeah, let's go back to really quick, if you don't mind, on Dallas, because you lose the gig as the GSM because they sell the stations, and then you pretty quickly land on your feet and become the GM now at HYI in Dallas. And so you put in your notes that you were too young, and but you're falling up, man. You keep on rising to bigger and bigger positions. Walk me through, if you don't mind, just now you've gone from being a very successful AE with a great list, and I think a lot of people, I know some friends of mine, that's where they wanted to be. And maybe back to your dad's advice, you had a drive. And let me kind of just frame this a little bit too. A account executive with a great list who's very talented, at least back when I was at a radio station, could actually make more money than the GM or the GSM and can do incredibly well. And so I've had some friends that kind of didn't take your dad's advice and just kind of said, hey, I'm good, I'll hang here and not take on the headaches of the management position. Mm-hmm. But what made you decide, and I guess we can pull back to your dad's decision, that you wanted to continue to elevate, become a GSM and then a GM?
Well, it's interesting. I mentioned earlier that I was a jock when I was younger, and I have always been very competitive that way, not only competing against others, but competing against myself. And so I think that's a part of my DNA, particularly at that time in my life. And so, I was driven. And the other thing was working for ABC. That was a very brilliant but competitive company. I mean, you were there to move up, not to exist. And so I think that was both of it. And so Belo announces they're selling the stations, and I get a phone call from a guy who I had no idea who he was, and he was buying a radio station in Dallas, and he goes, I want to talk to you about being my GM. Now I'm 31. And I'm like, GM in Dallas at 31? Okay. And so I took the gig, and it was the part of my resume that I want to use whiteout on.
That's a great line.
I had been blessed to work for two great companies in ABC and Belo, and this company did not want to do business in the way I thought it should be done. And all I will tell you is I accepted the job. Before we flipped the format of the station, the owner and the PD he gave me, I didn't even get to hire my own PD. That should give you a little framework. We went to dinner with my wife, and as we're walking back to the car, my wife, in all of her wisdom, turns to me and said, "You really effed up." And she was right. And even though the station was successful, I knew that this was a bad fit for many reasons. And so I looked for my window, and I actually resigned the job, frankly, on ethical reasons and business operation reasons, with no job in front of me. But I just knew that this was going to end badly, and made the decision to get out.
Well, that's astute of you at that age, and being so young and being in a position like that. Because again, I think in a lot of ways you're ahead of your time, or you were an old soul in having that kind of forethought. And then it turned out to be a really good move for you, because now you get an opportunity to go back to your home market and work at DFX.
It was great. Blank sheet of paper, hometown, really good plan. Rock 40 was just starting to happen. Detroit is a rock town. And of course, here I am competing against WRIF, and Fred's consulting WRIF at this point. And we came out of the box with like a 5.8 share, 12 plus. And I was really fortunate because some of the people I brought in were old colleagues from WRIF and my other travels. And it was like a band of brothers and sisters. And we just had a great time, and it was very successful. And then Hoker Broadcasting went bankrupt.
Oh man. Was it difficult because obviously you and Fred are close and getting closer now. Was it difficult at Thanksgiving dinner when you're competing against each other, or were you guys just able to separate the two pretty easily?
At that point, it was cool. You know, it was probably like when Travis and Jason Kelsey play each other, except we didn't bash bodies. Okay. It was like, hi, we're competing, but this is what we do, and pass the gravy. That's
a great analogy.
Yeah, it was fine, but I will tell you, in the last year of working for Jay, I had a life experience. I won't get too deep into it, but my daughter was born, and she was born excessively premature, and was in the hospital for 5 months and with no chance of living. And I began to see Hoker having financial issues. And I said to my very astute wife, we might have to move again. And that's when she punched me in the face and said, we doctors, family, everything are here. We can't go anywhere. And so that is when Fred and I began to talk about me coming to work for him or with him, which at the time was incredibly unusual because program consultants didn't have people like me as general managers, running around sucking up money. But I convinced Fred that, getting ratings is really nice, but getting revenue is also really nice. So why don't we merge? And so as Hoker was imploding, I joined Fred.
Wow. I appreciate you sharing that, and sorry you had to endure that with your daughter.
By the way, she's 34, graduated college, total rock star.
Oh my, I am so happy to hear that. That's incredible. That is amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's, we'll have to at some point break bread over. I'd love to hear more about that story. But
Absolutely.
What a happy ending. That's incredible. At that juncture, or let's back up a little bit. When you said, when you're first working the first time around with Fred, even though you were on the sales side, you always had an interest, it sounds like, in programming. You had kind of you were more so than, let's say, the typical AE or the, general manager. And so you obviously have this expertise as an account executive and a GSM and a GM. Fred's really a programming guy through and through. And so selling him on this concept in his the consultancy at that time was really focused just on programming.
Yeah. And a little bit of research, but mostly programming. But I have to tell you something. I'm a sales guy, but I'm a radio guy. I mean, when I hear people bitching about working in the business now for whatever reason, their companies or whatever, I'm like, fine, go to work for State Farm. See what that's like. I mean, this is a great business to work in, and it's fun, and we do cool things. And I think that's why Fred and I really have made it work, is because we are, even today, 40 years in, we are talking about the business every single day and still coming up with new stuff. So
excellent point. And when you join at this juncture, your brother Bill is also involved, correct?
Yeah. Bill's been here longer than me. And, again, Fred, brilliant programmer, running this small company, flying all over the country, and has never run a company before and managed people really outside of disc jockeys. So I was able to plug that gap. And my whole pitch to him was, hi, I'm going to let you do what you do best, and let me take care of everything else. And that was kind of how we got the thing started.
Oh, that's great. I've told this story a few times, but Roy and Walt Disney worked so well together because Roy was the creative and Walt was the guy that took care of everything else. And the two, there's no doubt that Disney would it would never exist if it weren't for the two, because Walt couldn't have done it on his own without Roy's financial, and Roy's ability to sell and get sponsors involved early on and financing so Walt could make his movies and eventually Disneyland and so forth. So it sounds like you guys have a creator operator marriage. Tim Cook and Steve Jobs are very similar to that as well.
Absolutely.
And when you joined, early in those days, were you traveling quite a bit at that juncture? Or are you staying more Detroit because of your daughter's health issues and everything else?
Well, and I was the GM. And at that point, there was a little bit of travel, but we were busy because, at that point, classic rock was like a rocket ship. And then right as I joined, Fred goes, "Hey, by the way, I've got an idea for a new format. We've kind of started it, but somebody needs to run it." And it was called The Edge Alternative. And we had one radio station in Dallas, and that was it. And so my job initially was to, Fred was the creative genius, but to figure out how to get it to market and get clients and things like that. And boy, that was a fun ride.
I bet. So you guys would go in, station owner group would hire you to bring in the format, launch the format, and basically program the station.
Well, hopefully they'd have a PD, but I will tell you, back in those days, what we used to do was here in Detroit, we'd build the selector disc. I'd go to Harmony House, the record store, and buy all the CDs because we didn't want the record companies to know. We'd hire a production voice, get all the liners and everything produced, fly to the market and go, "Here's your radio station."
That is so cool.
Yeah. But what we learned really quickly, Chachi, was if classic rock had some sales challenges, not many, alternative was really hard to sell. So what really happened was, and it was Bill at first, was implementing the format. I was with the sales team and visiting with the advertisers, kind of explaining to them the format, the value of Gen X, who were, 20 years old at that point, and really work with them, because otherwise alternative was going to fail. It did not have a natural advertising constituency.
Oh, even though the music at that point, you look at that grunge era, it
Huge.
Couldn't have been any hotter, but the advertisers didn't feel that there was value in Gen X at that juncture?
Exactly. And, but you know what? And I would say this to advertisers. When I was at WRIF in the 70s, they said the exact same crap about baby boomers. So it was like, you know what? I've been here before. And by the way, they're doing it today with millennials and Gen Z. They're making the same dumb mistakes with stereotypes and blindness. Absolutely.
Yeah, probably because a lot of the business owners are of the older generation, and we always want to, that's interesting. So you would actually go into the market once it's on the air, and then train and work with the AEs, go out on sales calls and help them with the packages.
Absolutely. And sometimes we'd invite the entire ad community in for lunch, and take a ballroom at a hotel and flip the format while they were there. So, you
made a production of it. That's
a little show business. Why not?
Oh, that's great. You guys really are showmen. And we'll get into into CES in a little bit, but you are incredibly in the bumper sticker story. Thank you for sharing that. That's a phenomenal story. So now you, as the consultancy continues to grow and you guys are doing bigger and bigger, you decide in 2005 to launch your blog, which has really become, I think probably the most read or the most, I can't say the numbers, but it is certainly the most well-known blog in the industry. Where was that born from?
It was born from Tim Davis. May he rest in peace. He was kind of our web 1.0 digital guy. And he had been following the blogging space, and he came to Fred and said, you ought to do this. I will tell you two things about it. It was the most brilliant piece of content marketing we ever could have done. And it was the dumbest thing we've ever done in our careers, because we committed to doing it 5 days a week. And to this day, we do it 5 days a week, which it's still wonderful. It's still well read, thank goodness, from people. But man, what a pain in the butt, because Fred writes it and I edit it every morning at 6:45.
even when you guys are at conventions and on the road, it's incredibly impressive, and it's always very well thought out. I mean, these are detailed entries. And I want to give you full credit. We stole your idea a few years later and did an imaging blog, which continues to be a great piece for us that Andy, my partner, oversees. But it is really well done. And if you haven't checked it out, highly recommend that you do so. And in terms of, so you guys start to put this content out on a daily basis, 5 days a week, which is a big undertaking. And did you see that impact, or did it take some time?
It took a lot of time. I mean, we started getting good feedback. Metrics back then were not great either. But it was okay. But I will say that when Seth Ressler joined us about 8 years ago, he built a social media feed for it, kind of a drip campaign. And that took it to even higher levels. But it's been really steady. I mean, it really has. We look at the readership daily, and, some days are much better than others, and, for whatever reason. But it's held on pretty darn well. And, the fun thing is that when we find ourselves in even non-radio situations, people come up to us and tell us they've read something, and it's like, wow, that's so cool.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. And I've read it so many times and have pulled so many ideas from it over the years. And it's really become a phenomenal brand and resource for the industry. And to your credit, maybe this harks back to your father as well, but you guys continue to reinvent yourselves and maybe that's that competitiveness in you, as opposed to just kind of in no disrespect to an AE's doing very well, but in living a good life, but you constantly wanted to grow and, I think build your skills both personally and professionally. Just a few years later, you guys now decide to launch Jack Apps.
So I got to tell you that story. So picture this. July 1st, 2008, Apple comes out with the App Store. In September of 2008, the economy completely craters. Remember? The housing crisis. Oh, yeah. Disaster. Jacobs Media is really challenged. I mean, a lot of broadcasters hit hard times. They're asking us for cancellation or cutting our fees. I mean, it was pretty brutal. And in the midst of all this, the same Tim Davis who came up with the idea for the blog walks into the conference room where Fred and I are sitting with our head in our hands. And he goes, "Let me show you something." Now, he's the only guy in the company with an iPhone. And Fred and I probably had flip phones at that point. And he shows us an app for a public radio station in Providence that streams the radio station. And we're like, wow, that's really cool. And we'd written about the iPhone in the blog and things like that. And we're like, wow, that is really amazing. And Tim goes, we ought to go into that business. And so Fred and I looked at him and at the same time said, "You are absolutely out of your mind. Nobody's starting a company, in this situation. Get the hell out of here." So he comes back a week later. He had contacted the developer in Providence, who was, his name was Stormy. And he was a stoner in his basement who learned how to write app code. And he cut a deal with Stormy to develop radio apps for us for $300 a piece. And so we're kind of going, So we called our good friend Tom Bender, who was the general manager of WRIF, who was our client at Greater Media. And we said, "Tom, would you buy a couple of these? We're thinking of doing this, and we'll charge you $990 because every GM needs permission over 1,000. And so Tom buys 4 of them, 2 for MMR and MGK and WRIF and CSX in Detroit. So November 1st, 2008, we send out a press release that Jake Apps was born. Now, understand, we had no capital. We had no business plan. We had no employees. We had no knowledge or expertise in how to write code.
I love it.
And we started the company. In the last 8 weeks of 2008, we sold 20 apps. And it was like, whoa, this is really cool. So 6 months into 2009, when we were up to 60 apps, we started hiring people. But that's how the company was born. And again, we'd been doing our tech surveys, so we knew that there was things happening with iPhones. But yeah, it all came together. And what really was cool about it, besides so many things, was most consultants tell you what to do. And what we actually did was we built something. And I think that really shifted our brand image because it was so out of character.
Yeah, it was out of character, and it again shows your entrepreneurial spirit that your backs were against a wall. You're in the throes of this recession, and you guys were able to now evolve to where the future was headed. And so much so, and you told me the story at CES, but when AirPlay came out at that juncture, Apple wouldn't allow most apps, or I still think they don't allow most apps, to be on AirPlay because they don't want to muddy up the screen. And you guys had to have several conversations, or if you don't mind, tell that story about how you guys were.
So it was Apple CarPlay, and Apple comes out with it, and we're like, and you know us now. I mean, we're like, we've got to be first. So the great thing was, we were one of the largest in terms of numbers mobile app developers at that point. We probably had 300 radio stations and other apps with Apple, but we had no contact at Apple because they don't talk to anybody. So CarPlay comes out. We try to reach out to them. We get rebuffed. Fred has a friend in London who has a contact at Apple CarPlay UK. He hooks us up with that guy who gets us a call with Cupertino with the CarPlay team. So we get on with them, and we're going, yeah, we've got, 300 apps and, radio in the car and blah, blah, blah. And they're like, we don't want 300 apps on CarPlay. And we're like, no. A normal listener only listens to like 2 or 3 stations. They didn't know anything about radio. They didn't care about radio. So make a long story short, we had 2 or 3 calls with them, and we realized for the third call, it's Hail Mary time, that we're going nowhere. And so it's like, okay, wait a minute. They're in San Francisco. They work for Apple. Maybe they listen to public radio. And we had done the KQED app, which is San Francisco's big public radio station. So we led with that. And you could see their ears perking up. And then we uttered believe it or not, the magic word for radio for Apple, podcasts. Because the KQED app contained podcasts. And that was it. They're like, oh, radio stations do podcasts? Great, we'll start approving you.
That's fantastic. So if your station app is on CarPlay, you've got Fred and Paul to thank for that.
Yeah.
Fantastic story, and thank you again for being such a proponent of the industry, because we all know how CarPlay has grown so significantly over the years, and I think it's vitally important that our industry apps are available there. So thank you for that. And you mentioned it, and I didn't even have this on my notes, and I should have. How did the tech survey come to be?
I'll try to make it short. It actually started right after September 11th. We'd been thinking about email databases, and a week after 9/11, we started getting calls from clients going, when can we get back to normal? Because what people forget, it was the week before the fall book, and they had marketing planned and contesting planned, and we didn't have an answer for them. So we pulled together 20 or 30 stations, and we came up with an email blast to a survey, and we got the answers in 3 days. And we're like, oh my goodness. And so within a couple years, as we saw technology, at that point, technology was AOL and, maybe Facebook, and email. But as we saw it beginning to encroach on radio, we're like, you know what? Why can't we use that model across multiple radio stations to get a handle on what radio listeners are thinking? And so that's where it started. And last year had 440 participating radio stations in the US and Canada. And it's just great because we can see things longitudinally, like Alexa. We can see what's going on. And it helps radio stations set priorities. Where should they put their resources? And it's simple.
And like the blog, it's so valuable for the industry. It gives us, all a tremendous amount of insight. I think the saying goes, desperation is the mother of invention. You guys are really good when your backs are against the wall of creating something. So the tech survey was right after 9/11, and then JCAPS came out of, the financial recession. That's incredible. Let's talk a little bit about, while we're on tech, CES, which, thank you again. It was wonderful going on the tour with you and learned a tremendous amount. When did you guys first start taking interest in CES?
So JCAPS launches, like I said, at the end of 2008, and Buzz Knight, who was at Greater Media at the time, had been going, and he'd been bugging us about it. So we looked at it and said, well, now that we have a software company with no employees, maybe we should, as software executives, go to CES. So the following January, I went by myself and was able to go as press, believe it or not, because of the blog. And as you saw this year, I mean, it's just mind blowing how big this thing is. But there was a seminal moment in that first year. So I went, one of the keynotes was Alan Mulally, the CEO of Ford.
Sure.
And the press conferences there are thousands of people. I mean, it's unbelievably huge. And it was when Ford announced Ford Sync, their dashboard thing. So they go through this whole thing and they say at the end, oh, and they featured Pandora in Ford Sync. That was the big thing. So they said, if you want to come backstage and play with Ford Sync, go ahead. So, of course, I run backstage, and they've got a Taurus or something sitting there, and there's a dude sitting in there. And so, of course, I climb in the passenger seat with a video camera for the blog and introduce myself. And his name was Julius Marschwicki, who is the head of Ford Sync. And I'm like, walk me through this thing. So he's walking me through Pandora, and I turn to him and I go, what about apps for individual radio stations in Ford Sync? And he goes, well, that'll never happen. And I'm like, come on, man. And so we started going at it. And so we became friends. And about a year and a half, 2 years later, he calls me up and he goes, bring your team down to Dearborn. I want to show you something. And Ford announced that they were going to start allowing individual radio station apps, and they needed a development company. And we became the lead developer for Ford Sync for radio.
What a story. That's incredible. Yeah. And that all came out of CES.
Absolutely.
I've been now the last few years and took the tour, but I couldn't really be a bigger proponent of going, because I think it's just so vitally important to understanding where the future is going. Certainly automotive is important, and most of the manufacturers are there and showing off their new technology, but just seeing the world and how it's changing. And I learned a tremendous amount. Our tour guide, obviously AI was a incredibly hot topic, as you can imagine, and a lot of different products. I mean, we're going to have AI in our lawnmowers, our washing machines. There's going to be AI just about everywhere we look. A lot about sustainability, which was really interesting. And I just did not know everything that goes into making a vehicle and their systems work. Everything from in the dash to Xperi's auto stage to how it's communicating through AT&T or different wireless services, clouds that are involved like Amazon. I mean, it is incredibly complex, but I'm excited about certainly the future. And what are your thoughts in general? And one of the booths you took us to and we learned a lot about was Xperi and Auto Stage. How do you feel about how that's going to help us in the future as an industry?
It's interesting. When you go to CES, you're one of 150,000 people and, several thousand displays that are amazing, most of them. And the first thing you notice the first time you go there is where's radio? Because there's not much radio there. Since we have been going, the only steady representative for radio has been Xperi. And it started in the Ubiquity days, when it was just HD radio. Xperi has emerged as not only a key conduit to the auto industry on behalf of broadcasters, and a very key one, but I think a really important visionary for radio's place in the car, how it looks, how people interact with it. And now with DTS Auto Stage, which is gorgeous, the data that they can get out of the automobile and share with broadcasters for free. So you can see where your audience is driving when they're listening to you. You can see how often they listen to you by day part, it's just incredible. So they are radio's best friend, with all apologies to Art Volo.
Shout out to Art and another Michigan resident.
Yeah, there you go. As it relates to the auto industry. And as you could see, the size and presence of their booth in West Hall, they are clearly carrying the water for us, and we should appreciate it.
It's impressive. They gave us a demo, a VIP demo, and they pulled up, I should say, the Coyote, which is a Beasley Country station in Las Vegas. And you can actually see a heat map of where the listeners of the station were driving around town in that moment of time, which was really impressive. They generate charts, all sorts of data, because they're able to see how long listeners are listening to individual songs. And I think it's going to be a fantastic technology. And I know, I think they had Hyundai there. They're in Harley Davidson now, BMW, Mercedes, Ford, and several manufacturers, Ford. So making some really good headway. Couple bonus questions. It sounds like your father was absolutely a mentor. Fred has been a tremendous mentor. Any other mentors that helped you really just guide you through the journey of your incredible career?
Yeah, not any that have been constant throughout, but clearly Fred and my dad are core. Marty Greenberg, who was running ABC and we followed down to Dallas, was pretty important to showing us vision and what's possible with the business. I do have to credit Ed, even though we had our ups and downs. But he's been he passed away a couple years ago, rest his soul. But he was, people don't know this, but Ed put my brother Fred in business.
I didn't know that.
Fred was, he resigned from WRIF after hitting a huge peak, and he said that's it. And he wanted to go into research and consulting, and he was still kind of formulating classic rock. But he was not doing much. And Ed called him up one day and said, look, let me give you a couple of radio stations just to, so you can eat and to get you going. And one was WNOR, FM 99 in Norfolk, which we worked with for decades. And, we'll never forget Ed and his graciousness. And that's as good as it gets. What
is advice for people or young people as we're getting ready for NAB here in a couple months, and the BEA, of course. And I think it's vitally important that we're getting more young people involved in our industry. What would be your advice to them as they wonder about the future and they see some of the, as we're trying to stay as positive as possible, but there is, we're looking at Odyssey, unfortunately, going through a bankruptcy. We saw iHeart and Cumulus do the same. And there's definitely been some struggles out there economically.
So you've just handed me a soapbox. I give this speech many times a year at various conventions, and it's called "You're Not in the Radio Business Anymore." Mm-hmm. And that is not to denigrate the radio business, but radio's superpower is its cume and its ability to move that cume, not just to listen to the radio station, because Nielsen is important, but it is a dying metric in that radio ad dollars are going down. So the value of that metric is declining. So radio needs to stop thinking that all it does is do radio and start thinking of itself as a platform and the ability to move audience around that platform, whether it's a newsletter or a podcast or events or whatever. And these events and podcasts and newsletters might have nothing to do with the brand. A great example I'll give you is the New York Times. Okay. The New York Times generates $40 million a year in subscriptions from recipes and $40 million a year in subscriptions from games. The New York Times has the #1 daily news podcast in the United States called The Daily. They are creating content for different groups and building businesses on their platform. And I guarantee you, the people who subscribe to recipes, not all of them read the New York Times, trust me. And so that's how we need to start thinking about it. And the great thing about radio, we have huge cume. We have huge presence in our local communities. And most importantly, we know our local communities. And so we know where the holes are and where the needs are. So when I talk to young people, the first thing I say to them is, you're not coming to work for a broadcaster. You're not coming to work for a radio station. You're coming to work for a media platform. And so how can we grow different parts of that platform with new content targeted at new audiences that may or may not listen to the radio?
Such a powerful, I've not heard that before. And I'm so glad I asked that question, because honestly, I had not thought about it that way. The New York Times example, I can tell you they've got a crossword. I don't know if it's an app or something, but my dad subscribes to their daily crossword, because he loves doing crosswords. But, if you look back, at like Mr. Beast, for instance, on what he creates on YouTube and in social media, he has created, I think, in a lot of ways of what you're saying. And I think he does, if you look at the bits he does, so many of those are radio bits that he's just really kind of thrown gasoline on and made much bigger.
Right. That's exactly right. Real quick sidebar on the recipes. So last year I was invited to give a speech to the board of a very large Catholic broadcasting company. And I got to the point of the New York Times example, and you could feel the board tense up. Because New York Times, liberal, pro-choice, I mean, you could just feel the room. And I knew it was going to happen. And I then pop up the slide with the recipes. And two of the board members start smiling. And so I get to the end of the New York Times piece, and I turn to them and I go, "You subscribe to the recipes, don't you?" And they go, "Oh yeah. How are they?" "They're wonderful." "Do you subscribe to the New York Times?" "Never." And so that's the opportunity. I mean, look at what Saga is doing. Are you familiar with what they're doing in Clarksville, Tennessee?
You know, I don't know if I am. And in full disclosure, Saga, we do their imaging and they use our libraries. They've been a phenomenal client. I know they've got the Beaver down in Clarksville, but I'm not sure if I do know what they're doing down there.
So the general manager down there was Katie Gambrill. And about a dozen years ago, she realized that in Clarksville, Tennessee, they were in a news desert. That apparently the local paper had closed up. And she had a vision for their radio cluster to create a news service that she called Clarksville Now. It's 12 years in. It is extraordinarily popular and profitable. Katie has now been promoted out of running the stations and is implementing these across the Saga company. And that's a platform. That's filling a need in your market with different content. It is not branded to the radio stations. It is a whole new business unit. And yet they can move the cume of the radio stations over there.
It's really intelligent.
Brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. And very similar to what the New York Times has implemented.
Totally.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's just a tremendous amount of advice, and so grateful for you to take the time. And I'm glad that we got to realize, I mean, we've known each other and obviously been a big fan of everything you guys have done, but I'm glad we got to break some bread and spend some time together in Vegas for CES. And I look forward to doing that again next year. And I want to thank you and obviously Fred for everything you guys have done for the industry. It's really appreciated.
Well, we appreciate it. We got a lot of fuel in the tank, and you know, there's a lot more fun stuff ahead. And here's the deal, Chachi. If we're going to break bread next time in Vegas, it has to be at Lotus of Siam.
Deal. Thank you, by the way. That's probably, of all the advice you've given me, that was probably the best, unbelievably good Thai restaurant that my girlfriend and I went to, thanks to Paul and Fred's recommendation. Absolutely amazing. So thank you for that. And that is a deal. Next year we are on.
Right. And thank you, Chachi. You're just a great friend to the industry and to everybody who knows you, and your spirit, I think, frankly, is incredibly additive to everything we do and everybody you touch.
Thanks for listening to Chachi Loves Everybody. If you like the show, we hope you leave us a 5-star rating and tell your friends. Make sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. This has been a Benztown McVeigh podcast production. Hosted and researched by Dave Chachi Dennis. Executive producer, Darren Silva. Producer and editor, Jake Urbanik. Show coordinator, Estefania Padilla. Marketing and distribution, Suzanne Aksu and Robbie Gessel.